All right, Paul, welcome to the podcast. Really appreciate you coming on, man.
I'm glad to be here, Nick. I appreciate you inviting me.
As I just mentioned to you before we started recording here, really excited. Maybe my most anticipated for my own personal curiosity pod that I've had, because from consuming the content that you put out and what you talk about is very right in the wheelhouse of what I'm most curious about at this point in my life, specifically for multiple reasons, which I'm sure we'll dive into a lot of them. And your kind of general theme is intersection of culture, religion, philosophy, science as well. And so to start it out in a very broad framework, how much of culture is downstream of religion? Would you say it's
Oh, man.
100%, 10%, 50%?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so I often talk about this in maybe three layers, right? So maybe the most fundamental layer is what we would say is like human nature. Humans all have a shared nature, just like you might see throughout the animal kingdom, where you would say, hey, there's a number of different kinds of dolphins, there's a number of different kinds of apes. But you would say dolphins have this kind of nature. So they have this intrinsic desire to pursue these sorts of things in their life. Same thing with any animal in the animal kingdom. And humans, in some sense, are in that regard no different. So we have like this universal human nature where we could go across culture and see the different ways humans are pursuing particular things that we go, hey, like I could go all the way across the world to China and find, lifelong Chinese people with no exposure to American culture pursuing this end and this end. So for example, right, like we could talk about it from a biological perspective. We all we want to survive, which is really important, right? We do have a like hard written into us a desire to reproduce, but we're also inherently social as a species. So we are primarily like social creatures. Now, we can go across cultures and see facets like that humans long to be in community. They long to pursue these ends. But culture is the arena where our human nature takes on a unique expression in the social groups that we inhabit. Now, the question about where religion fits into that is I would define religion as the ultimate guiding story of a culture that helps them understand what should be of ultimate concern. Now, this is a very different understanding than I think the modernist caricature of what religion is. A great example of this, like caricature for me, is, and I don't tend to demonize the guy at all because he's a brilliant biologist, but it's kind of the caricature you'd often see from like a Richard Dawkins when he talks about religion as being about fairies and gods in the sky, right? And if all we need to do is like to propel humanity in an unfettered path towards utopia, all we need to do is remove all of these superstitions. But what Dawkins misunderstands about, I think, a more ancient and historic understanding of what religion is, which is actually a relatively new term, is that religion is that ultimate guiding story of a culture that helps people understand and pursue what should be of ultimate concern. So when I think about religion, Nick, I am in a traditional religion, so I am a lifelong Christian. But there are also, along with the other great historic traditional religions of the world, you might think of Islam and what we call nowadays Judaism. Ancient Jews didn't call it that. Buddhism, Taoism, etc. I'd say we also have a lot of like substitute secular religions. I grew up as an athlete. Basketball was my primary sport. I got a basketball scholarship. I'm very much attuned to sports culture. And you can get around guys who may not have any traditional religious commitments. And you find that the ultimate guiding story of their life might be, I'm here in Minneapolis, St. Paul. It might be the outcome of the Viking season. And some people might laugh at that, but for them, there are people where like the ultimate guiding story of their life that gives them their ultimate sense of meaning and purpose is the outcome of a Vikings football game. And that, though we wouldn't traditionally, like at least in modern sense, define that as religion, if it helps someone become aware or maybe names what should be of ultimate concern in their life and of ultimate pursuit in their life. That is, for me, what religion has historically been. So, which comes first, like culture or religion, chicken or the egg? I don't know if we could actually separate it, because we're always enmeshed in a culture, right? So there's no
Mm-hmm.
single atomic individual out there who's living like the Jungle Book life, detached from any sort of culture whatsoever. We're all enmeshed in a culture. So it's really hard to parse out, could you have like, culture without religion? No, it's actually impossible. And I think we're learning this more and more, that religious pursuit of ultimate meaning, for me, that's what religion is about, is an inescapable part of the human experience. And I think we're learning actually more and more through the sciences that humans are an inherently religious species, meaning we are always pursuing meaning, and we always want to figure out what's the most meaningful thing to pursue.
Spot on that. When you mentioned the sports, coming from an athlete myself, and I was that guy for a long time. From Pennsylvania, Philadelphia guy. So Eagles lose on Sunday, like the rest of my
Yeah.
week shot. It's like,
Yeah.
what's the point? And it's funny to now be removed from that for multiple years now and see what it was. But in the grips of it, you're just living your day-to-day life, and you don't realize that it is a quote unquote religious experience that you're going through on a daily, even weekly basis. Well, especially the NFL, every Sunday you're going to the stadium or you're going to watch the game, and so it's just like the specific time and place, you're cheering for these specific people, and sometimes even praising these people, and it has all the symbolism of a religion within this
Yes,
greater or smaller context.
for sure. And, as a fun thought experiment, if you pictured like on a Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon, aliens from another galaxy descended upon the United States, and they were looking for evidence of what the religious ritual was of the people of America, I think the place they would first go to is actually an NFL stadium. The churches are not as full as that NFL stadium, and they're going to see all sorts of religious rituals. You're going to see like a sacred meal together, which is like the tailgate, right? Everybody gets together. And actually, in some ways, like the tailgate, this is going to sound silly to some, maybe even to some, my pastor friends out there, but the tailgate is actually like more akin to what early Christians were doing in the first 2 centuries when they practiced communion. Communion in the first 2 centuries of church history was a community potluck meal, right? And the really radical thing about it was that you had people from all different social status levels in the social status ladder gathering together around this shared meal. And the thing that was really weird that Christians were saying that the Romans were totally freaked out about was they were saying, yeah, this is like the body and blood of Christ. And then they actually were being accused of the Romans of being cannibals. They're like, what is going on here? I bring that up as an analogy to say, you go, and if the space aliens descended on planet Earth and went to the major cities of America, I think they would show up at, I don't know what the Eagles Stadium is these days. What's the name of the Eagles Stadium?
Lincoln Financial.
Lincoln Financial. Okay. So they pop in Philadelphia. They're going to Lincoln Financial, and they're going to go, this is the thing that's most important to these people. And look at this ritual, shared meal together. In many ways, these people are enacting, like, they're painting their faces. They're adorning themselves in these like religious garments. I mean, like, no offense to dudes that wear the jersey of another grown man in their life, but you show up to a game and you're like reenacting the gods that you worship. And then you have this like battle of good and evil in front of you. And there is this liturgy. So like at a Vikings game, for example, like on 3rd down, they have the Galler horn. It's the Vikings call to battle. And every 3rd down, they blow that in US Bank Stadium. And you have to stand with the Galler horn. And then you have these chants like skull, 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 right? All of these things are like mimicking. It's like hymn singing. There's a fight song, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's all of these like rituals there that are expressing deep meaning to people. And I think if aliens from another galaxy showed up, I don't think they would probably show up to like a local church to understand what's of supreme importance and value to these people of Philadelphia or Minneapolis. I think they'd probably show up to an NFL stadium.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. It is just, again, this is nothing that obviously any of us consciously think about in that moment. It's just like this unconscious meaning and symbolism and just purpose of why all this matters so much to us. Like, on the face of it, there's no reason that an NFL game should really matter all that much to anybody, but it can be life or death.
Yes. Especially in Philadelphia, right? If you're a visiting fan, Lincoln Financial,
tough place to
go. It could be life or death.
Exactly. But why do you think classic religion, I'll say, has been on the decrease in Western civilization, if we want to stick to America specifically, over the last 100 years or so?
Yeah, that's a great question. It would, to satisfactorily answer it, it would take volumes of books, but I'll highlight a few points of maybe relevance that might be important. If we think about religion in the meaning-making framework, which is about the pursuit of an ultimate guiding story that helps us understand what should be of ultimate concern, there are ways in which I'll take my own religious tradition in which Christianity was no longer providing satisfactory answers to the deepest questions of human longing and understanding. So, for example, in one area in particular, in my own tradition, so I would be more, I'd be more in the Protestant vein. I didn't grow up Roman Catholic. Both my parents were Roman Catholic, and then they had their like what they would have called in the 70s their born again experience, and moved into, we never used this term, but moved into more like evangelical spaces. So I'm speaking from my own tradition here. One of the deficiencies of my own tradition, for example, was that we did not have an adequate framework for the integration of these new scientific epiphanies that was hitting the Western world and the rest of the world for like 2 centuries. So, for example, in the 18th century, you really have the beginning of modern geology, where geologists were going out into the world and actually motivated by, at the time, what was called like natural theology. So natural theology had to do with like, can we understand God through creation? And natural theology was a really big thing in the 18th and into the beginning of the 19th century. And so you had geologists going out to study the world, and many of them are actually setting out, for example, to find evidence of Noah's flood. But the weird thing they didn't expect was that they found evidence of not just like one global catastrophe, but really overwhelming evidence that there had been a series of global catastrophes in the Earth's past. And for many people who had a particular like reading of scripture that was trying to make the Bible a science textbook, they struggled to reconcile, well, where are all these other catastrophes in the story? So we came to find out that, like, for example, 65 million years ago, there was a global catastrophe that killed off all of the dinosaurs. Many in my tradition denied that that ever happened because they didn't see that story in the Bible, if that makes sense. They were assuming in our tradition that the Bible and the biblical authors were setting out to answer that question, which I learned as I got older, because it was a point of dissonance for me and for many people who grew up in my tradition, the science-faith conundrum. The thing that I learned was I had the wrong assumptions about what the biblical authors were setting out to actually describe. And so I was importing my modern understanding of the world and the questions I have on the questions that people, let's say you're an ancient Israelite and you're in Babylonian captivity in like the 6th century BCE. You do not have a question about what we would call modern science in your mind. And so when the biblical authors are trying to give them the inspired story of meaning, they're not having questions about what happened to the dinosaurs. Like, I hate to break it to you, but by all accounts, like, they didn't even know dinosaurs existed. Like, the the true discovery and the naming of dinosaurs is an 18th, 19th century phenomenon. Just like you wouldn't expect like the Apostle Paul in the New Testament to know about quantum mechanics. So if I go reading like in, let's say, the epistle that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church at Rome that we call Romans in the New Testament, and I go in asking, I wonder what Paul thought about quantum mechanics. It's like the completely wrong question, right? But what many in my tradition were doing were like forcing the biblical text to answer questions that maybe the inspired, what I would consider in my tradition, inspired authors weren't trying to answer at all. And so that's one example, right? So you had like I can't make sense of a world in which it's really clear that 65, I mean, the overwhelming evidence, and I want to be respectful to those that maybe still disagree with me on this, but the overwhelming consensus right now is 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs were killed off. Humans and dinosaurs never walked the earth at the same time. That, for a lot of people, was like, do I have to believe this biblical story or do I have to believe the story of science? And I do think for me, there's many other things we could point to, Nick. We could point to things like hypocrisy in the church. We could point to the corruption of the church in various church traditions, whether it's been Catholic or Protestant. Those are all important factors as well that has led people to be like, man, this traditional religious stuff is nonsense. But I'm highlighting one of them, and that's been like, for example, the science faith divide. And I think for many reasons, that is why that was, especially in the heyday of new atheism, which I'm a millennial. So post 9/11, for example, you had like the rise of Dawkins and Dennett, Sam Harris, and I'm not demonizing any of those guys. I want to be clear. Each of them are very brilliant men. Christopher Hitchens, for example, very brilliant in their own but what they were reacting to was like this is Dawkins 101. The Bible and science, they don't reconcile at all. And so a lot of people in my age and our age in particular, Nick, that like grew up in the church and were like, this stuff doesn't answer one significant chunk of my questions about the world, like evolution and science. They go, man, I can't live in that Christian story anymore. So maybe like the story Dawkins is telling is better. I will add this as a follow-up to that. There has kind of been like maybe a full circle thing that's happening right now over these last few years where a lot of young men in particular who like loved the Dawkins stuff started realizing, for example, like in Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, he essentially tells people that love is an illusion. It's an illusion that we experience because we are primarily selfish and we just want to pass on our genetic code. So when I fell in love with my wife, all that was going on with me was I was identifying features in her that seemed like they were be good for reproduction, right? So I look at her and I go, man, she's cute. What I'm really identifying are the ways my selfish genes could be passed on through her to create children. And so for Dawkins, like that's all love is. Like I don't actually love my kids in a way like traditional religion would say this is what love is. For Dawkins, it's like, yeah, it's just your genes. Like your genes, your DNA wants to survive. And so you care about your kids because you actually just care about, it's not even caring. It's like your programming is just like, hey, part of my programming is I want to protect and preserve my genetic code through my progeny. And people started realizing like, that's an awful story to live in, right? So now they're like going back and being like, well, maybe the traditional religious stories offer me more meaning. But then like, how do I reconcile the stuff about the dinosaurs and evolution and all these other things with those traditional religious stories? And that for me is like the space I'm like most excited to explore with people.
Yeah, and that's like right in the intersection of basically where I'm at right now. As I mentioned before we started recording, I'm kind of new religious. I did go to church growing up at Catholic church and got baptized, did all the sacraments, all that stuff, but was never a believer. I never would have called myself an atheist growing up or anything like that. I probably would have just always said I'm agnostic. But now kind of reflecting back over the past year or so, thinking about myself, then it was definitely was atheist. And so to your point of that kind of circling back, myself as part of that, um, I'm trying to grasp the scale of that right now. Me and a few friends here, and again, these are friends from church now that I never would have been in prior years, that we're trying to figure out if this revitalization or whatever you want to call it is actually happening on a bigger scale, or is it just happening right in front of us so we think it's happening on a bigger scale?
No, I think it is happening on a bigger scale, and there's a lot of we're in the middle of it. So I think it is still unfolding in a way that maybe 5 years, 10 years down the line, just like we're able to have, with some hindsight, a better understanding of what was happening in the new atheist movement in the mid 2000s, right? I can look back and go, yeah, after September 11th, it seemed like religion, this was part of the new atheist argument, like, look what religion does. Do you see what these radical Islamic terrorists did? And so religion gets lumped into this category that every religion is ultimately this. So we have a little more insight now with time and perspective. So it's going to take some time and hindsight to be able to really assess what's going on, Nick. But I would say it's not just, I will say this with certainty. I can tell you from the number of stories of people listen to my podcast, friends of mine who are actually working in similar spaces, you are not alone in what's going on. There is a crazy resurgence of religion. Now, some of it I have some concerns about. Some of it I think is genuinely authentic. I will address one of my concerns. I do think there are pockets of resurgent interest in religion because on one account, people are starting to realize that Western civilization, in order for these things like us to have free speech, for us to be able to have charitable relations with our neighbors, there has to be some set of shared story. And at least in one strain of the resurgence, I do think there's maybe a number of people that are like, Western civilization is going to collapse unless, whether or not we actually believe like Jesus was the Son of God, we better just choose a religion. And so we're going to pick Christianity because that was where we came from, and it's almost more for me that I think God can still use that to bring people into what I would say is like an authentic discipleship or becoming students of Jesus. I think that's the term I'm most commonly using. My goal is to become a student of Jesus, like Jesus as a philosophical teacher, yes, Savior, Lord, all the other terms, but he's also a teacher. And so when I go and I work with a personal trainer or a coach, that relationship is the relationship I'm after. It's like, teach me the way to live. So I think people can get there, but I also think there's something going on too, which is like, we don't want the West to collapse. We feel like the West is on the verge of collapse. So we better grab onto something. On the flip side, though, Nick, on a more positive angle, I do think there is a significant resurgence and interest in the Christian story, in the person of Jesus, because of nihilism. So at the end of maybe a road in which you adhere to the meaning-making story of a Richard Dawkins, and you're like, my love between my wife and my kids is merely selfishness, it's empty. And you get behind Dawkins' story, and behind Dawkins' story is a universe that's mindless, chaotic, random. There's no purpose. There's no mind behind the matter. It's just matter in motion. And so we don't have any purpose or true significance to our lives. If you actually accept that story, you're going to end up in complete nihilistic despair if you're being consistent, right? And I think we actually see that in pop culture. Like, I think there's a lot of people that, for example, like in the 90s, right, it was the Fight Club story that was really popular to my generation. Because what were men feeling at the time? They were feeling like, I have this empty, meaningless life that I realize I just sit and work in a cubicle all day so that I can collect enough money to get furniture in my apartment, right? Like that was the dissolution of the dissolution of meaning that the main character was experiencing. It's actually the same thing behind. It's funny, like both of these movies, Fight Club and The Matrix, come out in 1999, and both of them revolve around guys who are completely dissatisfied with the lack of meaning in their lives, and they're searching for meaning, right? Neo finds it in this sort of like a journey of following the white rabbit. But what are they both experiencing? I'm sitting in my job. I don't know what I'm doing, because behind it all, I don't have a story that tells me there's anything meaningful or significant to my life. So I think what you might be experiencing, Nick, and maybe your friends are going like, I can't live in that story, right? And even like, here's my thing, Nick. I go, okay, so maybe Dawkins is right. Maybe it all is meaningless, random, just stupid chance that there's anything at all. Just a sheer statistical improbability came to be, right? Whatever's behind the Big Bang, whatever's behind life itself is merely just a random accident. If that's the case, well, so be it. But if I'm going to be wrong about something, for me, Nick, I'm gonna be wrong and err on the side of a life that's actually full of meaning. And so I can look at my wife and my kids and say, this is more than just selfishness. There's actually some meaning to this love I feel. And this love I feel for my friends and my neighbors. And my life has meaning, and it's part of a story that's going somewhere. And my life has significance. Like, it has significance because it's not just empty, random chance behind it all. Like, I actually live in a story. If I'm going to be wrong, Nick, I'm going to be wrong on that side. And at the end, if Dawkins is right and all of our atoms just like decay back into the random chance that is constantly recycling matter and energy in a perpetual state, if that happens, I won't know the difference, you know? But my life will have been totally miserable. Or I'm going to live like Rick from Rick and Morty. You know, I'm going to just have this, like, I'm going to be a hedonist. I'm going to have no real meaningful connections to anybody at all. And I can't live in that story. And so I think a lot of men and women, but men in particular, our age, are going, yeah, we tried that story for a bit. And it's like, nah, I got kids and I got a wife, or I want to have a wife one day. Like, tell me a story that makes any sense of that being meaningful, makes my work meaningful, or help me figure out what I can do with my days that is meaningful, that is like filled with purpose. I can't shut that off. Like, humans cannot, we are fundamentally meaning hunters more than anything else. We don't just need to survive and to sexually reproduce. That's not satisfactory. We hunt for meaning. And so for me, I look at what's going on, Nick, and I go, obviously I have my own vested interest in this particular story, this Christian story. But I'm excited that men in particular, women as well, are like, we're not living in that story where it's just nihilistic despair. And we're going to search for what's actually a meaningful, vibrant life full of significance.
You pretty much hit my story nail on the head there.
That's great.
Yeah, definitely a lot of nihilism, definitely a lot of hedonism throughout the years. And what it really has come down to over the past, let's say, I mean, really from the beginning of the year is when I started re-exploring my relationship with God and with Jesus and the Christian faith specifically. Came down to a lot of what you just said, of just one. At the end of the day, we get to choose our beliefs to a certain extent, and so why not choose a belief that makes you feel good rather than one that is kind of meaningless and one that doesn't inspire any hope or any meaningful direction in your life. And then the other one was whenever I was in that, so out of college, just like goal was money, make more money, that'll solve all my problems, make me feel better. And was in the corporate world for like 6 years out of college, and did very well, and wasn't, by like 25 was making like $100,000, and just at that point I realized, well, I'm still miserable here. So I was thankfully smart enough to realize that it's not going to be 500,000 or $1 million is what's going to make me happy, but it did shift it from money to freedom. And so it was like escaping this corporate world. And so I spent a couple years working on that and eventually did escape the corporate world. And whenever I did, this was like kind of right when I started creating content and posting stuff online. And I looked back to what I posted right when I created or right when I left. And like the number one thing I wrote was like, the number one North Star in my life is freedom. Freedom to do whatever I want, whenever I want, with whoever I want. Don't have to answer to anybody. And I achieved that. And I spent, before I moved here to Jacksonville at the beginning of the year, I spent the last year and a half prior to that traveling throughout the world, doing whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted, and enjoyed it. But at the end of it was still something that was very unsatisfactory about it on a deeper sense. And what I realized is that whenever I did get back and whenever I got back, I was just spending a lot of time visiting friends, visiting family, and I enjoyed that just as much as all the traveling that I did, all the places that I went. And so it's really started to make me like reassess what is out there and like what drives meaning, what drives purpose. And when I moved here to Jacksonville, a friend invited me to church with him, and throughout this process, I was at this point for that year and a half very into like the Eastern religions and was big into Ram Dass and Alan Watts, and still think they're great guys and obviously say a lot of very intelligent things, but reestablished a relationship with the Christian faith here. And I think I'm going to butcher the quote, but how C.S. Lewis says is like, we have this purpose, this desire in us that can't be fulfilled within all of these material things of the material world. And so that probably means there is a unmaterial thing out there, God.
Yeah, we're made for another world. Yeah,
exactly.
What was that bridge for you? Like going from, kind of like the Alan Watts into going, hey, I'm going to go to church. Because there's a lot of people that never make that. And Alan Watts has a lot of really unique, interesting things to say. I think there is truth in what Alan Watts describes about the human condition and what we're longing for. But a lot of people maybe stay, and I often call it like DIY, do it yourself spirituality, right? Where it's like, I want to stay selecting a la carte from this guy and this guy so that I can retain that individual freedom, But I'm like, as you're mentioning that's like a interesting point of how am I going to go from that to there? So what was it for you? I'm not to turn the interview back towards you, but I'm really curious about it.
Yeah. So for that year and a half, so like I said, I was an atheist basically my entire life. Then in 2021 is when I became a theist, believe in God and that stemmed from a ayahuasca ceremony. But then, like I said, went to the Eastern religions. And at that point, it was just like, this wasn't necessarily conscious at the time, but it was like anything but Christianity, anything but Jesus, because of my Catholic upbringing, wasn't a fan of it. And just felt like it was kind of all fake for the most part. But what I do like kind of pride myself on is just being a open person and curious. And so I did just kind of go to church that first time, and we went to, it was a non-denominational kind of mega church. And so
how did you select it? Like, how did you select what church to go to? Was it a friend? Did you have mutual friends? Was it an invitation? Did you just Google search like what's around me?
No, it was just a friend knows the church that they went to. And so went with them and really enjoyed just the pastor, even though I'm still like hung up on some things that he says, but he's just a very engaging, authentic pastor and preaches, from the word. And so without anything, I was like, I'm going to be able to learn something here. Just even, I didn't go into it thinking or wanting to become a Christian per se. It was just like, if anything, I'll be able to say like, I gave it a chance and it wasn't for me, or like, I understand it better in this way. I can argue against it.
Yeah.
And then really it was like probably June so I just basically went to church for 6 months. I also joined a disciple group, Bible study group as well. And again, just to like say, I gave this a fair shake. And then in like June time frame is like really, it was like, I really need to like jump in this full bore and like figure out if I believe any of this is true or not. And so just went on this super deep rabbit hole of a lot of Tim Keller, a lot of C.S. Lewis, a lot of other just podcasts and sermons and just books as well. And after about, I don't know, coming up to breathe after a couple 100 hours of just studying things, it was very much like C.S. Lewis's encounter or story of believing was that, he said, I just drove to the park, and on the way to the park, I wasn't a believer, but by the time I got home, I was a believer. And very much similar to me, where after, all the studying for about a month or so straight, month and a half, still wasn't necessarily set, but I just went out to the beach one day and was just sitting out there staring out into the ocean, and it just hit me. It was like, yeah, this is true. And
Wow.
and what I loved specifically is that Tim Keller has been like probably the biggest influence on me. And he has this great podcast series called Questioning Christianity. And it's like a 12-part series or something like that.
Yeah, for sure.
And it was just a way to make it make sense. Again, I think C.S. Lewis said the same, like, in order to believe, I needed to make sense. And that's the work that I wasn't able or wasn't ever willing to do before, was to really sit down and say, like, does this make sense? Is it something that I can believe in? And if so, why not? Drop the ego and let it.
That's awesome. You just nailed one of the features. So I talk about this a lot, and I'm going to forget the other co-author of this paper, but there was a paper in 2016 by a couple of cog-sci guys. One of them was a guy by the name of Michael Steger. And what they were looking for was like, what actually contributes to a person's sense of meaning? And at the time, they identified 3 characteristics, and you've named one of them, and I think it's interesting. The first of which is what they called coherence. So as someone who wants to experience a sense of meaning in life, they need to know that there is some sort of repeatable, discernible pattern to life. So when we're looking for like a meaning-making story to guide our lives, we are looking for something that's coherent. Like, is this actually make sense? And it sounds like, for you, maybe you had experienced in other places something that gave you like a taste of meaning, but maybe wasn't coherent enough to live in, a story that is actually like, oh, this connects to this. It's internally consistent, right? I can make sense of it. Not that by making sense, we grasp it in its entirety. So I want to differentiate between those two, because there's, for a lot of people in particular, especially those that might be attracted to listening to podcasts like you put out, which are, very deep and very thoughtful. I want to differentiate between a sense that this is a coherent story and a story that I fully and completely grasped and have completely mastered in my understanding. That those two things aren't the same. But is it coherent? Is there a discernible, repeatable pattern to life? So that's the first structure. The second structure is what they called purpose. And purpose is, does this discernible, repeatable pattern to life, does it look like it has an overarching goal? So is there an overarching goal to life? So if I find something that's a coherent story and I go, oh, there's a repeatable, discernible pattern here, does that story also give me something that shows me this is the point of that pattern? That would be purpose. And then the final category is significance. And significance has to do with, what role do I play in life's overarching purpose? And it sounds like to me, Nick, what you found in the work of Keller and others, and even just in the community that you probably experienced in that church, was a story that was coherent. It told you there was an overarching purpose to life. And on top of that, there was a role for you to play in the story. Because sometimes people can experience like 1 out of 3 and they still feel complete emptiness, right? So they might go, hey, I do see a sense of coherence internally in Dawkins' story. Materialism, reductive materialism, is maybe internally coherent to a point where it's like, yeah, if I follow, physics and biology, those systems of science do seem to overlap and show us things that are like coherent. But then behind it, it's like, is it telling me something that has any overarching purpose to life? Is there a goal to this? And it was like, for Dawkins, it was like, no, evolution is just a part of the mindless, random, chaotic processes. And it's like, okay, so there is no purpose to life. So you had 1 out of 3, but sometimes people can have like coherent story. They say life is, does have an overarching purpose. And many people still, I want to confess this and be honest with anybody, any of your listeners, Nick, that are like interested in Christianity, whether they, go to a non-denominational church or they find it in Eastern Orthodoxy, which has become really popular, or Anglicanism or Catholicism. I'm not here to make an apologetic case for any one of those or against one of those, but I do want to just say truth in advertising here. That there is times in which people experience, like, they go to church and they find coherence and they find purpose, but they still struggle individually with significance. Like, what role do I play in the story? And I want to confess, it's not just going to church is not just like the magic bullet that solves all of it. Because there are people that are in our churches that go, yeah, like, I get there seems to be some coherent story here and God's behind it. And I feel like I understand like a general sense of the end goal, the telos of all of this. But I still feel internally like I'm not playing any role in it whatsoever. I don't like my job. I'm in a difficult family relationship. I'm like always arguing with my spouse. I don't feel like I play any role in the story. But when people experience all 3, that's where it feels like, yeah, we got all those buckets filled up. And that is when life changes. When they feel like I'm in a coherent story. It tells me the overarching goal and purpose of life in general. And it actually, I get a sense that I am playing some significant role in the story. And by significant, it doesn't necessarily mean that I am like doing something on paper that sounds huge and significant. Like in like maybe Western American marketing terms, right? If you look at the life of Jesus, for example, you would say, by some accounts, you might go pretty insignificant. Like, and there were major amphitheaters around in the Near East, ancient Near East, where Jesus lived. Jesus never spoke in any of the major amphitheaters. He never visited Rome, right? By all accounts, he went around to like the podunk towns of Nazareth, and people were like, what good has ever come from Nazareth and Galilee, the surrounding area? And maybe there's some debate about how much time Jesus ever even spent in Jerusalem, which was like the urban network of that area, but still in the big picture was Jerusalem was like insignificant. So maybe he was in Jerusalem the final week of his life. So there's some different scholarly opinion on that. And then he died with like none of his disciples except for one at the cross, and then his mom and another female follower. All of his friends abandoned him except for John. That was the only disciple that was there. Like, Peter denied him, right? And you might go, well, yeah, he rose from the dead in the Christian story, which is totally true. But even when he rose from the dead, it wasn't like, instantly the emperor was a believer, of that story. It was still like pretty insignificant. And so when I mean a life of significance, it is also important for men in our propensity to desire high status, especially if you're a high testosterone driven dude. That is physiologically and biologically hardwired into you. If you have higher testosterone levels, you have a natural propensity to pursue higher status in social groups. What I want to say about the significance thing is that it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be like super high status, popular. A life of significance might look like the life of Christ. And that's what we actually say. Here's the paradox, is that the ultimate significant life actually looks like the life of Christ, where we lay down our life for others and for the sake of the flourishing of the world. And there seems to be a bit of a paradox in that. And I don't know if anybody can really get it until they actually start stepping into it. And you go, oh my gosh, everything I thought was significant isn't. Like you're saying, like, I made all this money. This is kind of what I'll slow down here because I feel like I'm getting a little preachy, Nick, but it's kind of like what the author of Ecclesiastes, which is one of the books in the Old Testament, considered part of the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. And the teacher of Ecclesiastes goes like, and I've tried everything under the sun. I've had tons of women, tons of sex, tons of money. And in the end, it feels meaningless. Like it's empty. And we need to break ourselves free of the illusion that the attainment of those things would equal significance. And there's this really, really radical claim that's made in the very end of the Christian Bible. The final book is Revelation, and a lot of people like find Revelation totally trippy. They don't know what to make of it. I won't address all that, but there's this really interesting picture in Revelation where John, so like the one guy that was at the cross, the only disciple that was at the cross, gets a vision. And one of the things he sees in this vision is this, it's a really weird picture, but it's so cool. He looks out and there's like a throne that's like ruling over all the cosmos. And on that throne isn't some like badass jacked king with a huge sword and scepter and all that. He sees on the throne a lamb that was slain, like a bloodied lamb, which is a metaphor and picture of the crucified Christ. And so John sees that the thing that actually rules over all the cosmos is this slain lamb. And it's a crazy picture to think about. Because I'm tempted to go, well, it feels like what killed the lamb is actually what's in charge. And the Christian story says no. So my life of significance is not attached to like attainment of high status positions. It's actually in a life of service, of giving my life to others. And that is actually what a significant life looks like. And I think once men in particular, and I'll speak to men and I'll stop preaching here, but like men who realize there's nothing wrong with being like a high testosterone dude that's like, I'm trying to pursue status. But like Jesus kind of like inverts that pursuit and goes, the thing that we're pursuing that's actually going to give you eternal status is a life of service dedicated to love, to making the world a better place, not through power and conquest, but by service, generosity, charity, like carrying your cross, you doing the hard thing, right? That to me, I just had to mention that about what significance looks like, because I do think when people feel like what's a significant life, I don't know if they get it in those terms.
I'm going to have you preach a little more here with this question. To that point of back to either Fight Club or Matrix, like just, I think that mindset of, majority of men live lives of quiet desperation is, a constant throughout all time, probably even more so now. So it is a lot of guys feeling insignificant in their day-to-day lives. What can people do in a, I guess, very practical way to boost that significance, regardless of what your profession is or what status is that you do hold?
Oh man, Nick, that's a really good question. So I wouldn't want to like rank these in terms of like you need to do this first, second, third, but I would say there are parallel components to that you could put side by side and say, hey, these practices together or this kind of life will help you maybe step out of that sense of meaninglessness and nihilism. The first of which is to ask myself, am I actually living in a true story? So I think part of what we experience when we experience despair is the brushing up of our lives against the true and proper grain of reality. And what I mean by that is I do think there is a going with the grain of God's intended order for reality, and there's a going against the grain. And when we go against the grain, what we experience is like despair, death. We experience emptiness. And so that's not to say that, people that are experiencing that are living terrible, awful lives. I want to clarify, but I would say one place to begin is to go, maybe there's assumptions here about what the purpose of life is that I'm brushing up against and going, oh, I'm actually just running against the grain of reality. And so for like taking your own story, Nick, and you're like, man, I went around the world, I did all the stuff I could do. And like the teacher in Ecclesiastes, I felt like vanity, vanity, it's all empty. I think what you were experiencing was a necessary part of your journey, which is to go and be like, hey, I'm going to try this stuff. And when I brush up against it, I still feel this deep sense of despair. It's like I'm going against the grain of reality. So what is the grain of reality and the track that I want to get on? So that's one thing. And I think that might be the biggest one is like, am I living in a true story? And then once you find a true story, there are some, I think, necessary ingredients that do have to get with the way our human nature was designed and hardwired. I do think, for example, and this can be particularly difficult in the way society and our culture is structured. And I wrestle with it too, Nick. I do. Is like, we are inherently made as a social species to be in meaningful community with each other. And I would say modern life isn't necessarily structured in a way where we have that built in. If you were living, the African plains hundreds of thousands of years ago, and you're in a hunter-gatherer's tribe and you're hanging out with the same 15 to maybe 120 people, that seems like the max capacity for like early Homo sapien communities. You know everybody there. Your life is dependent on theirs. Their life is dependent on yours. There's a deep sense of connection. Obviously, you're going to be working through really hard things in that group. With closeness comes whole sorts of things. But I think one thing is our modern age, we have our workplace like as an opportunity for relationships, especially when you get out of college. This is really hard, especially for those that have just come out of college, in particular, their early adult lives. Men wrestle with this seemingly more than women. Women, on average, maybe have a higher aptitude for relational connection than men initially. But when they get out of college, they're like, dude, I had all these guys in my dorm room I was super close with. I had to move for a job, and now I'm like just working with these people. And it's like, this isn't my tribe. We are tribal. Like, we are inherently like a tribal species. Now, that tribalism can do a lot of bad things, but we are made for communities with each other. So one practical thing that's just, even if you're like, I don't know what I believe about all of these metaphysics of like, Christianity, and I don't know what I make of like a guy that claims they're making claims about this Jewish man that rose from the dead. I don't know what to make of it. What I'd say is like, there's not atheist churches out there. So if you're made for community, and it's like, either I'm going to find it at work or I'm going to find it at the bar. A lot of people might experience a strong sense of community, like in their CrossFit gym, which is awesome. And those are beautiful places, like a softball team or something like that. But just yesterday, was it just yesterday? Just yesterday, I sat in a funeral in our church for a man, 82 years old, just died of dementia, wrestled with dementia for the last 10 years. Several years ago, there was a birthday party thrown for him in his memory care facility. And there was about maybe 30 of us at this man, Wayne's birthday party. Wayne was at such a point in dementia where he didn't remember me. Like, and I would see him like every week at church. They would bring him into church. But he was surrounded by people, and this was so cool, Nick. People might go, that's still depressing, but what was so cool is people took turns telling stories from Wayne's life about the times. Yeah, we went down to Mexico and we built some housing for people in poverty on our church missions trip, and Wayne did this. Wayne couldn't even remember that stuff, but the community around him remembered him, and we're telling these stories of real, for me, masculine valor about this guy's life. And we sang some hymns, and I'm looking in the back of the room, and the memory care nurses are in tears, and they're like, we caught them afterwards, and they were sharing, they said, hey, outside of like church, when people get to this point in their life, they don't have people that show up at their birthday parties, maybe a few family members. And here this guy was surrounded by like 30, 40 people who cared enough and found enough community with him. I'm like, I'm 40. I've only known Wayne for a few years, and all those years he has had dementia. He doesn't know me from week to week. And yet I was able to celebrate this man's life. We just had his funeral. He passed away over the past weekend, and we had his funeral yesterday, and there was 250 people at this 82-year-old man's funeral who had dementia the last 10 years. And I tell that as an anecdote to say, we outside of church community, I don't know where else we go in today's culture for meaningful, deep relationships. And so my encouragement might be like, hey man, just try one out, even if you don't know what you believe about that stuff, just so you can have a shared, meaningful life with other people who will remember your story. And I will remember Wayne. I would not have known Wayne if it weren't for church. And if it weren't for church in Wayne's life, he might have gone through the last few years with maybe just his wife there and a few family members, but instead he was surrounded by people that cared for him. So I would say find a community like that's really important. Assess the story that you're living in. You're made for community. You're made to serve and to lay down our lives for the betterment of others. And so if you do that with your life, I'm telling you, even if you don't know what you believe about all the philosophical stuff and the theological stuff, and it's like, I'm just going to put my life into a place where it's acting kind of like Christ, which is to say, I'm going to care for the least of these. I'm going to serve without expecting anything in return. You will just find experientially an increase in meaning in your life. And again, there's no magic bullets. There are days in which I go, is there any purpose to this at all, Nick? So I'm going to be transparent. I don't live a life every single day where I'm just brimming with excitement and meaning and purpose. There are days in which I go, man, maybe the story I'm believing isn't true. And that's part of like an authentic journey and struggle of faith. It's not all roses. People die. I sit there at the memory care facility and go, why did dementia hit this guy? But I also know like tough stuff comes for everybody. And I rather have the tough stuff happen in a community of people that love me and I love them and I care about them. I don't know where else to find that.
Beautifully said, and I love that story. And again, just perfectly encapsulated my own experience over the past 7-8 months now, since the beginning of the year, of getting into a church and disciple group and just meeting people that are more generous to me after meeting me for the first time than people that I've known for years. And it's just truly amazing, and I agree wholeheartedly. I would love to talk to you for another like 3 hours here, but we'll keep it concise here. I do want to throw out just like one or two kind of random questions real quick.
Great.
And
Let's
then we'll go into my final question I asked everybody. But the random one, the first one is, earlier you mentioned Eastern Orthodoxy, which is getting extremely popular.
Yeah.
Why is that becoming popular as it is in a culture that is very secular, to go to that extreme end of religion? Why is that catching on, do you think?
I would point to a few reasons. I wouldn't say my list is comprehensive, but I would point to a few reasons. I do think the attraction to things like Eastern Orthodoxy or people joining an Anglican church or Roman Catholic church, part of the appeal is we actually are really in our world in which it feels like we are hit with complete overload of options to choose from in our lives, that we always have to take it upon ourselves to direct everything about our own lives in an endless sea of options. We're always choosing things, that we have to build our own spirituality. I think those more liturgical traditions, in their emphasis on tradition, and are like, hey, when you come to church, this is what we're going to do. We're going to follow this liturgy every single week. I do think there's something like a counterbalance that those traditions afford, that people are like, yeah, I just want to step in and I don't need to understand it all. I'm looking for ritual. So I think ritual is a big component that people actually don't know that they're missing from their life. And a ritual that is actually better than there's rituals that are happening at those NFL football games, right? But these are places in which people are experiencing ritual that's filled with awe and mystery and wonder. I do think that Eastern Orthodox tradition, for example, has done in many ways a better job of outlining what has been historic ancient Christian theology in some areas. So, for example, one of the emphases, and I'm not Eastern Orthodox, but I appreciate this, one of the emphases in Eastern Orthodoxy has been something called theosis. And theosis is this concept that God became a man in Christ Jesus so that, and here's the term, it can be confusing, or the phrasing, God became a man so that man might become God. Now, that can sound really weird, but what the ancient church fathers were describing there was what they call in Eastern Orthodoxy theosis. The goal of life, all of life, is union with God. Union with God, which is like this union with the very essence of all being, whose in its very nature is love. And so they have a pathway and a clear sense of purpose that your life every day is to grow in greater union with God, who is the fount and source of all that is true, good, and beautiful. And that is very appealing. And the way they've told that story in many ways has been so much better than some of my more Protestant brothers and sisters who have often focused on, well, Jesus died on the cross to save you from your sins, to save you from this. And I think one of the good things the Eastern Orthodox tradition has emphasized is, what is it saving you to? And the answer to their question is like, it's cosmic, dude. It's like you're being saved to union with God. And you're like, what? So well done, my Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters, for like telling, and that has been, this is Jesus's point actually in John 17. There's a prayer that Jesus prays, and it's often called the high priestly prayer. And what Jesus says in John 17 is like, here's what I want for everybody, that they would be one. We would experience unity together, brothers and sisters, that they would all be one, even as this is Jesus speaking, even as you and I are one. So that is like, well, how one are the Father and the Son? Well, historic Christian theology is like, they're part of the triune God. There is an inseparable bond of love and communion that the Father and Son have experienced for all time. I get this is like maybe really cosmic, heady theology stuff, but Eastern Orthodoxy has done a good job of announcing that facet of the good news is you are saved to union with God, to an experience of love that you cannot possibly fathom. And so in that, it's like, here are rituals and traditions that can kind of be a counterbalance to things like postmodern thinking. And so there's definitely appeal there, but you can find that in other traditions as well. But I do think there's definitely kind of an appeal to the Eastern Orthodox tradition right now because of those positive things that they're offering.
Yeah, fascinating. Second one is the role of, actually I want to take a step back and frame it a different way. So your YouTube, which I love, is a lot of intersection of pop culture and spirituality, meaning, so on and so forth. What role does pop culture per se, and maybe just like movies, TV shows specifically, play in shaping broader culture? Is that downstream of culture, or is culture downstream of these narratives, these myths that are being created throughout pop culture?
I think they are co-shaping each other. So there's a bottom-up and a top-down process. So let's take, we've been talking about The Matrix. I'll just go back to that one. The Matrix was a very influential movie in pop culture. What was happening there in The Matrix? So The Matrix was grabbing on to some things that were happening in culture, like discontent, a sense in which like secularity wasn't enough. So this story that all we are is matter and nothing more, that we're just machines in a big machine. That sense of despair, the Wachowski brothers, well, they were brothers at the time. I won't get into, there was a gender change there later, but they were tapping into something that was happening in culture, right? And then they used the medium of pop culture communication, big blockbuster movie, great like fantasy sci-fi elements, incredible stuff they were doing with like the bullet time CGI stuff, well choreography, fight scenes, things that were already existing in culture, and they were kind of finding a way for those two to intersect to say something that was naming something that was going on in the cultural moment. So I think one of the things I try to encourage people to do is you think about movies and television shows as cultural texts, like a book. We don't maybe engage with works of fiction as much as we do with television and movies. They're cultural texts that are telling us things from that author's perspective, from the creator's perspective, the content creator's perspective, about what they think the true, good, and beautiful life is all about, And even if you take a really dark movie, so like there's like the new Joker movie is coming out, part 2. And if you look at the last Joker movie with Joaquin Phoenix in it, really dark. I mean, it was heavily dark, but in that darkness, I could see, and I can't remember the director's name off the top of my head, he was showing from his vantage point what he thought was true, good, and beautiful through that darkness. And from my vantage point, one of the things he was highlighting was we have overlooked peoples in our culture that nobody is paying attention to. And his warning, for me, it was like a prophetic warning. If you don't pay attention to these people, there is a bad effect that happens in your culture. So pay attention, or your society and civilization. So don't overlook the guy with schizophrenia, the guy that's doing the menial job as the sign holder on the corner, even if he's dressed as a clown. So those cultural texts are telling us things. I like engaging with them to see like, hey, what are these content creators and storytellers attempting to tell us is true, good, and beautiful? And then to have like critical engagement with those cultural texts on their own terms. Be like, hey, this is what they're saying. Is that actually true, good, and beautiful? I think those are really fun conversations to have with people. And it's actually a great point of like practicality, Nick, is like, I think a lot of, speak to men again, but this is true for women as well. They might not be apt, especially early on in a journey of like spiritual discovery, to sit down and to read like a book of theology. But if you want to talk about like a movie that has loaded with sense of meaning, maybe some philosophical or theological claims happening in the movie, I think that's often a much easier point to get people to start thinking more deeply about the world. Because it's not just entertainment. These are stories that might be telling us, hey, this is what the guiding story of your life should look like. And we often find ourselves, we identify with characters in those stories, and we take those stories into us. So they're really, really powerful components for shaping the way we see the world. So we should talk about them together, assess whether it's the right way we want to live in the world, whether it's showing us true, good, and beautiful things. And yeah, that I love engaging with those facets of culture.
Yeah, it's fascinating because even if you don't consciously like know that it's there, because for most of my life I never really saw the philosophical undertones or just meaning undertones of movies or anything, but it is working on you on a subconscious level at the very least. And so these things are affecting you one way or the other. So to be able to recognize the stories that are being told and the myths that are being told can have impact on you, whether positively or negatively, on how you recognize it.
Can I tell you a quick one as an example that always gets people laughing when I talk about this? For example,
Please.
I always say Top Gun can't exist without Martin Luther of the Protestant Reformation. And people go, well, what are you talking about? Top Gun couldn't exist. The movie Top Gun couldn't exist without Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. And when you start to see what happened in the Reformation, you have a guy in Martin Luther. The previous worldview that was dominant in the West was everybody is given a position by God in the culture. Some people call it the divine right of kings. And over the top was the Roman Catholic Church. And over the top of that was the Pope. And you have your kings, you have the Pope, you have the institutions of the church. If you're born as a peasant, your job is just to be the best peasant that you can be. And you never challenge the level above you, because that was placed there by God. That was the dominant worldview. Along comes Martin Luther in the Protestant Reformation. He's like, hey, I'm seeing some corruption in the level above me, and I'm going to post it to the Doors of Wittenberg, my 95 theses, that I'm like, this is what's wrong. This is what's wrong. So you have a maverick individual who is saying, hey, at the level above me, they don't know what they're talking about, and I'm going to challenge that. People completely underestimate whatever you make of Luther's theology, and there's lots of things I disagree with Luther's theology on. The impact of that on the West was, guys, we don't get like representative democracy in America unless Martin Luther's like, hey, here's the deal. You have access to the truth. Even if the people above you are saying something different, you can counter them and make your own claims to the truth. You have access to the truth. So Luther goes around teaching, you have access to God through Jesus Christ, and it's not mediated through your priest, which then people start thinking about government that way. And now they go, all right, well, maybe these people aren't put in authority. So what if we were the authority? Well, what kind of government would that look like? It leads into the Enlightenment all the way down to Top Gun. Because the premise of Top Gun is the same. It's the same modernist assumption. Maverick perceives the truth more so than his superior officers. He brushes up against those that were, in this case, not necessarily corrupt in Top Gun, but they're just not competent. This is the story that we connect with all the time. You know, it's what makes like Han Solo in Star Wars a compelling character. It's the maverick guy that goes up against the institutions. And it's really cool when you start learning more about history and philosophy and theology, that even something you might go, dude, Top Gun is just a popcorn movie. Dudes having dogfights, you know, and fighter jets. It's cool. But you're like, well, why am I rooting for Maverick? You wouldn't have rooted for Maverick before Martin Luther. That's my argument. That you wouldn't have rooted for Maverick before Martin Luther. So whether or not that's the correct thing to root for, it's interesting for me that you trace that train of thought all the way through something like a popcorn flick, and it's like, where did that idea come from? Because that wasn't a story that was popular. You know, the hero's journeys of the past were not about how you rebel against institutions. And you go, where did that come from? So quick little example of that. And you're like, Martin Luther and Top Gun? Like, yep. It's all connected.
All comes together. Yeah, all comes together. I love it. One final question on that. Do these writers, directors, are they consciously aware of like that story and like they're framing the script and the story of the movie around that? Or is it just like, oh no, just fighter pilot and he has some corporals that are incompetent and he goes against them? So do they understand it, or is that just like their subconscious myth making story working through them without them even kind of really realizing it?
Yeah, I think both are the case. You know, I don't know who the filmmaker was that did the original Top Gun or Top Gun Maverick. I'm not suggesting they're going like, hey, we really need to tell Martin Luther's story in the form of an allegory set. You know, no, I'm not saying that, but sometimes it is the case. Like, for example, you take a guy like Christopher Nolan. Christopher Nolan as a filmmaker definitely knows what he is doing at times to make us engage with certain philosophical ideas. We'll take one quick example, Nick. We'll take The Dark Knight, you know, the second in Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy with Heath Ledger as the Joker. What is Heath Ledger's opening line in the movie once he takes off the mask? It's a play off of Nietzsche. He goes, whatever doesn't kill me only makes me stranger. That's a terrible impression, but he says, whatever doesn't kill me only makes me stranger. Nietzsche's quote is, whatever doesn't kill me only makes me stronger. And then throughout the movie, Joker's character acts as a Nietzschean critique of ethics. So when he tells the Batman, he's like, you know, these people, do you think they're actually ethically superior to you? All they have, essentially, the cops, all these other people, they just have power. And so they get to make the rules, right? Nolan is definitely incorporating especially because there's times you can see him actually grab specific quotes like that and twist them ever so slightly to make his point. So I think Nolan is someone that does that. Terrence Malick, the guy that did Tree of Life. What else? What's another Terrence Malick film? What's the one set during World War II? Terrence Malick is a deeply committed Christian, though most people wouldn't identify him with like a particular Christian tribe. And he is bringing in stuff from like rich theological insights into his films. And now I'm really bummed that I can't remember the name of that World War II film Terrence Malick did. There's a couple of them. I think Terrence Malick did The Thin Red Line. That was one of them. And then,
So he's got
now I'm just gonna have to look.
Badlands, Days of Heaven,
Oh, let's
New
see.
World,
A Hidden Life. A Hidden Life.
and
Yeah. I
Life.
mean, he did Days of Heaven. Yep. Thin Red Line. A Hidden Life is another one where you're like, you can see him, the main character is grappling with all these different Christian positions on what's the relationship between the individual and the state. What's the relationship between the individual and politics? Because the Nazis have come in to occupy this man's homeland, and he's wrestling with it. It's beautiful. So you can see that, but oftentimes too, Nick, it is just like it's in the water that we're all swimming in, because it's contributed to those cultural inputs from the past become just our grammar and our vocabulary that we use. So we're not always conscious of it. Filmmakers aren't always conscious of it. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they will explicitly be like, I want you to wrestle with this idea.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, Paul, again, I could talk with you for hours on this stuff.
Yeah, me too, Nick.
We'll call it here. My final question that I ask everybody is, what is your why? Why do you do what you do?
Man. My why is, I think the story that I'm living in, though I don't claim to have perceived it all in its entirety in truth. I think the story that I am attempting to live in is the true story of creation and the cosmos. And my why behind it all is I want to live faithfully in that story. That's it. I want to, whatever my role is in it, I just want to be faithful in it. I want to do it well. And behind it all is, for me, ultimately union with God. But it's a union with God that takes place through the transformation of my character, so that I desire more and more of what's true, good, and beautiful. So day in and day out, and this is maybe I'd love to have some talk with you, maybe bring you on my pod sometime to talk about athletics and how this plays a role in the shaping of our character. But I'm on a journey where in the end, I believe every day, I think what's most important is my character being shaped more and more towards what it's intended for. And that is the ultimate source of what is true, good, and beautiful in God. And am I being changed in that direction? So my why every day is about a journey of character transformation. I want to be more loving. I want more of the fruits of the Spirit. I want more love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, meekness in my life, so that I'm continuing on that trajectory towards what I think is the very end goal for me and for all of humanity, which is like, I would have the virtues of Christ, and I would experience love that I can't fully fathom even right now, even though I've tasted it in part. And I want my life to be submersed in that kind of love. And I will hold on to the promise that living in that kind of love, somehow, some way, I don't get how it all works, that means I will one day be able to live in perpetuity in that bond of love. And it's euphoric. It's we get glimpses of it here, but the glimpses I have tasted of that kind of love, I go, that's what I want to live for. And I want my character to be changed in such a way that I can live in that love fully without the dark sides of my life getting in the way, causing harm to myself or others.
Beautifully said. And I would absolutely love to come on your pod anytime. And so if people are inspired by this convo and want to get in touch with you or learn more about all the things that you have going on, where is the best place for them to find you across the internet?
Yeah. Okay. So the name of my podcast is Deep Talks, Exploring Theology and Meaning Making. Most people just go with the short name of Deep Talks, but it's a podcast dedicated to exploring stuff like this. It varies between having conversational guests on, like what we're doing right now, and I will do like lectures too at times to help people maybe explore stuff that's in heavier works of academic theology and philosophy, try to make it a little more simple. So if you wanted to follow the podcast over there, you totally can. I am on I still am going to keep calling it Twitter. I can't get the word X out of
Always
my
Twitter.
mouth to call it X. But I
Always Twitter.
appreciate that it's being rebranded. So I'm on Twitter, on X, if you're on there. I'm navigating right now my relationship to Instagram. If I want to keep doing it, if you're on there, you can follow me, and I'm in the midst of evaluating whether or not the continued connection to Instagram is producing what I want in my character and in my soul. So if you're on there, you can find me and send me a request. But I'll probably know in the next month if I'm going to keep being on Instagram or not. Also on YouTube, but primarily it's the audio podcast is the primary hub for me in doing my work.
Awesome. We'll have all that listed in the show notes so people can easily find you and connect with you. But
Cool.
Paul, thanks again for coming on. This was as good or probably even better than I was hoping, and I had high hopes for it.
Thanks, Nick. It was great talking with you. And again, I want to reciprocate, have you back on my podcast to hear more of your story and what you can contribute to the regular listeners of my program.
Would love to. Appreciate you, Paul.
Thanks. You too, Nick.